The summer of 1722 brought no respite from the fear. If anything, the longer days and the increase in travel for trade and harvest festivals seemed to provide more fuel for the growing panic. The disappearances continued, and the authorities in Münster, pressured by both the public and the local nobility whose trade routes were being threatened, were forced to take more concerted action. A special commission was formed, not of professional detectives, a concept that did not yet exist, but of a particularly grim and determined city magistrate named Gottfried Bauer, a small contingent of soldiers and a few trusted trackers from the surrounding villages. Their method was as methodical as the era allowed. They would canvass the taverns and inns along the major thoroughfares, paying special attention to the last known locations of the missing men. It was tedious, frustrating work, and for weeks it yielded nothing but conflicting accounts and superstitious nonsense. The breakthrough came not from a witness, but from a smell. On a sweltering afternoon in late August, Magistrate Bauer and his men were investigating a remote stretch of road that connected two smaller hamlets. It was an area of dense woodland and poor soil, dotted with the isolated farmsteads of those who lived on the very edge of society. As they passed by one such property, a small, dilapidated hut with a thin curl of smoke rising from its chimney, a foul and unmistakable odor washed over them. It was a stench of decay, yes, but also something else, a greasy, cooked meat smell that was profoundly unsettling. The trackers with the group exchanged grim looks. They knew the scent of a slaughterhouse, and this was not it. This was something wrong. Approaching the hut, they found the occupant, a man in his late 30s named Franz Schmidt, splitting wood. He was a large, broad-shouldered man with a placid, almost simple expression. He did not seem alarmed by the arrival of the armed party, merely nodding and continuing his work. When Magistrate Bauer questioned him, Schmidt gave short, simple answers. He was a charcoal burner, a solitary trade that explained his remote existence. He lived alone. He bothered no one. It was what Bauer saw over Schmidt's shoulder in the dark interior of the hut that sealed the man's fate. Hanging from a hook near the fireplace amidst the normal tools of rural life was a human arm, severed at the elbow, its skin cured and smoked like a ham. The horror of that moment is difficult to overstate. For a long second, the world seemed to stop. Then chaos erupted. Schmidt was seized and restrained after a brief violent struggle, his placid demeanor vanishing into a bestial rage. A thorough search of his property unveiled a chamber of horrors that would haunt the men who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. Buried in a shallow pit behind the hut were the partial remains of at least 8 individuals, their bones cracked open from marrow. Inside, a large iron pot contained a stew, from which a human finger and several other unidentifiable pieces of flesh were retrieved. Butchered portions of human anatomy were stored alongside salted pork and venison, the ultimate blasphemous perversion of the larder. Tools, knives, saws, and cleavers were found, still caked with blood and tissue. Franz Schmidt, the quiet charcoal burner, was not just a murderer. He was a farmer who cultivated human beings as his crop, a butcher who processed human flesh as his sustenance. He was the source of the shadow that had fallen over Westphalia. The Münster cannibal had been caught. The subsequent interrogation, conducted in a dank cell beneath the city hall of Münster, was a descent into a moral abyss. Under pressure that would be considered torture by any modern standard, Schmidt confessed. His motives were not those of a political fanatic or a wronged man seeking revenge. They were starkly, terrifyingly simple: hunger. He described a life of abject poverty, of failed harvests, and the slow, gnawing emptiness of perpetual malnutrition. He claims the first killing had been an accident, a fight with a traveler over a stolen loaf of bread that had escalated fatally. Starving and faced with a corpse, he had done what he felt he must to survive. He had butchered the body and eaten it. And in that act, he told the magistrates, with a chilling lack of emotion, he had discovered a terrible secret. The meat had sated his hunger. It was, he said, no different from pork. From that moment on, a switch had been flipped. The taboo was broken. the accidental killer became a deliberate predator. He began to lure travelers to his hut with offers of shelter or work, preying on the most vulnerable, those who would not be missed. He described his methods with a craftsman's dispassionate detail, speaking of the different cuts of meat and the best ways to preserve them. His confession was not just an admission of guilt, it was a recipe book for damnation. The monster has been captured and has confessed to crimes so vile they defy comprehension. But the story is far from over. The legal and theological machinery of the 18th century must now grapple with a crime that challenges the very definition of humanity. How does a society punish a man who has devoured its own kind? The trial of Franz Schmidt will become a spectacle of justice and a sermon on sin, and its conclusion will be as brutal as the crimes themselves. To witness the final judgment of the Münster cannibal, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter. The trial of Franz Schmidt was not a lengthy affair. In the year 1722, the judicial process was swift and certain, especially for a crime that had so thoroughly horrified the entire populace. The proceedings were held in the Great Hall of the Münster City Hall, a room that had witnessed the rise and fall of the Anabaptist kingdom centuries before. Now, it was the stage for a different kind of spectacle. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and the palpable anticipation of the crowd that had gathered to see the monster in the flesh. Schmidt was brought in, chained at the wrists and ankles, his large frame seeming to dwarf the guards who flanked him. He showed little emotion, his face a mask of bovine indifference as the charges were read aloud. Multiple counts of murder, robbery, and the unnatural and devilish sin of anthropophagy, a term that drew gasps and muttered prayers from the onlookers. The evidence presented was overwhelming and grotesque. Magistrate Bauer and his men testified about the discovery of the hut, describing the smoked limb and the grisly contents of the stew pot in vivid, unsparing detail. The physical evidence itself was brought into the court, the knives, the saw, the pots, and passed before the judges, each item a silent, damning witness to the atrocities. Schmidt's own confession, read aloud by a court clerk, filled the hall with a stunned silence. The judges, learned men of law and theology, listened with faces of stone, but their horror was evident in the white-knuckled grips they kept on the edges of their benches. The defense, what little of it there was, centered on the claim of extreme necessity, that Schmidt had been driven by the primal urge to survive a famine. This argument was swiftly and decisively rejected by the prosecution and the panel of judges. Famine, they argued, was a tragedy that befell many, but it did not turn every starving man into a cannibal. Schmidt had not merely scavenged the dead in a moment of ultimate desperation. He had become a hunter of men, a planner, and a predator. His actions represented a conscious and repeated rejection of the divine order, a descent into a state worse than that of a beast, for even beasts did not prey systematically on their own kind in such a fashion. The theological implications of his crimes were perhaps even more significant than the legal ones. In the 18th century Europe, cannibalism was the ultimate sin, a perversion of the natural order that placed one outside the grace of God and the community of man. It was associated with the most vile pagans of the New World, with the servants of the devil in ancient legends, and with the monstrous figures of folk tales like the werewolf Peter Stump, who had terrorized Bedburg over a century earlier. Schmidt was not just a murderer, he was a living embodiment of evil, a testament to what could happen when a human soul was utterly lost. The judges retired for a brief deliberation, but the outcome was never in doubt. Franz Schmidt was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death. But a simple hanging was deemed insufficient for a crime of this magnitude.
The sentence was designed to be a symbolic and brutal act of purification, to erase the stain of his existence from the world and to serve as a terrifying warning to any who might contemplate following his path. He was to be executed in a manner that reflected the brutality of his own actions, a public spectacle of pain and divine retribution. The day of the execution dawned cold and gray, a fitting atmosphere for the event that was to take place. A massive crowd gathered in the main square of Münster, their eyes fixed on the raised platform where the sentence would be carried out. Schmidt was brought in, stripped to the waist. The executioner, a hooded figure of dread, stood ready with his tools. The sentence was read aloud one final time for the benefit of the crowd. Then, the punishment began. First, with red-hot pincers, the executioner tore pieces of flesh from Schmidt's body, symbolically destroying the flesh that had consumed other flesh. The sizzle of burning meat and the man's agonized screams echoed across the silent square. Following this, his right hand, the instrument of his murders and butchery, was chopped off. Finally, after this prolonged torture, he was put out of his misery by being tied to a wheel, and with a final blow from an iron bar, his chest was crushed. His body was then left on the wheel, raised high on a pole at a crossroads outside the city, where it would be consumed by birds and the elements, a denial of Christian burial and a permanent, rotting reminder of the fate that awaited those who transgress the most fundamental laws of God and man. The body of Franz Schmidt hangs on the wheel, a grisly testament to the price of unspeakable sin. But his story does not end with his death. The legend of the Münster cannibal would seep into the very soil of Germany, intertwining with older myths and shaping new fears for generations to come. What is the legacy of a real-life monster? The echoes of his crimes are still heard today. To understand how one man's hunger created a permanent folk devil, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
The public execution of Franz Schmidt was intended to be a full stop, a definitive and brutal end to a chapter of horror. But the memory of his crimes proved too potent, too deeply unsettling to simply fade away. Instead, the story of the Münster cannibal began a strange afterlife, evolving from a historical criminal case into a pervasive element of regional folklore. To understand why his story held such power, we must dissect not just the man, but the world that created him and the human psyche that remembered him. His actions forced a confrontation with a terrifying possibility: that beneath the thin veneer of civilization, a primal hunger lurked in everyone. A hunger that, under the right circumstances of extreme deprivation, could consume one's very humanity. The role of famine cannot be overstated. The early 18th century was a period of significant climatic cooling, often referred to as the Little Ice Age, which led to repeated crop failures and widespread food shortages across Europe. Historical records from the period are filled with accounts of starvation, and while outright cannibalism was rare, the fear of it was a constant specter. Schmidt's defense, though legally rejected, tapped into this universal, primal fear. He became a dark symbol of what could happen when the social contract completely broke down, when the struggle for survival stripped away all moral and ethical constraints. His story was a confirmation of society's deepest anxiety, that the neighbor you trusted, the quiet man who kept to himself, could be harboring a monstrous secret born from the desperation that poverty and hunger could breed. Furthermore, the Schmidt case did not emerge from a cultural vacuum. Germany had a long and rich tradition of folklore featuring cannibalistic monsters, and his real-world crimes seamlessly merged with these ancient archetypes.
The most direct parallel is the legend of Hans Trapp, a terrifying figure from the Alsace region. According to the tale, Trapp was a wealthy and powerful knight who made a pact with the devil and developed a taste for human flesh. He was said to disguise himself as a scarecrow to lure children, whom he would then murder and eat. The legend holds that he was ultimately struck down by a divine lightning bolt before he could consume a young shepherd boy. The similarities are striking. A figure who appears ordinary, even pitiable. A scarecrow, a poor charcoal burner, who uses this facade to lure victims and whose ultimate crime is anthropophagy. Franz Schmidt became a new, terrifyingly real incarnation of the Hans Trapp archetype, proving that the monsters of folklore were not just imaginary, they could be living, breathing, and walking among the populace. Even more chilling is the connection to the earlier, more famous case of Peter Stump, the werewolf of Bedburg. In 1589, Stump was accused, under torture, of being a werewolf who had killed and eaten numerous people, including his own son. His confession, though undoubtedly coerced, spoke to the same cultural fears. A man transformed into a beast, a consumer of human flesh. Stump was executed with nearly identical brutality, flesh torn with hot pincers, dismemberment, and display on a wheel. The judicial response to Schmidt was a direct echo of the punishment meted out to Stump over a century earlier. This continuity demonstrates that in the German psyche, the crime of cannibalism was not merely a homicide. It was a supernatural transgression that required a ritualistic and extreme punishment to cleanse the community. Schmidt was not accused of lycanthropy, but in the public imagination, his actions placed him in the same category of subhuman, demonic entities. His case was a bridge between the superstitious witch hunt era of the 16th century and the more enlightened legal world of the 18th century, proving that some fears were timeless. The legend of the Münster cannibal, therefore, is a complex tapestry woven from three inextricable threads: the harsh historical reality of famine and poverty, the powerful folkloric tradition of human-eating monsters, and the legal and theological need to violently purge such evil from society. Franz Schmidt was a real man who committed real atrocities, but by doing so, he ceased to be just a man. He became a story, a warning, a new verse in an old dark song used to frighten children and enforce social norms. He was the embodiment of the hunger that could consume a soul, a reminder that the true darkness was not in the haunted forest, but in the potential within every human heart to, under the right conditions, become a beast. The story of the Münster cannibal has faded from history books, but its DNA is woven into the very fabric of our darkest stories. From the Brothers Grimm to modern horror films, the archetype of the human predator who consumes its own continues to haunt us. Why does this specific fear hold such power across centuries? The final chapter explores the enduring legacy of the cannibal in the human imagination. To confront the monster that never dies, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the shocking conclusion.
The public execution of Franz Schmidt was intended to purge his evil from the world, but as we have seen, it merely transformed him from a man into a myth. The archetype of the cannibal, solidified by cases like his, Peter Stump's, and the legend of Hans Trapp, did not vanish with the coming of the Enlightenment or the Industrial Revolution. Instead, it evolved, adapting to new societal fears and finding expression in new forms of media, from the fairy tales of the 19th century to the sensational true crime stories and horror films of the 20th and 21st centuries. The cannibal remains one of our most potent and enduring monsters because they represent the ultimate transgression, the consumption of our own kind, a perversion of nourishment, community, and life itself. In the 19th century, the grim realities of peasant life, so starkly illustrated by the Schmidt case, found a new, sanitized form in the collected fairy tales of the Brothers Grimm. Stories like Hansel and Gretel and Little Red Riding Hood are, at their core, tales of cannibalistic peril. The witch in her gingerbread house seeks to fatten and eat children, and the big bad wolf literally consumes the grandmother and plans to do the same to Little Red Riding Hood. These stories, read to children at bedtime, served the same function as the whispers about the Münster cannibals centuries earlier. They were cautionary tales. They taught lessons about the dangers of the unknown, of straying from the path, and of trusting strangers with hidden predatory appetites. The witch and the wolf are the folkloric descendants of the charcoal burner in the remote hut. They are the supernatural externalization of a very real human threat. The 20th century witnessed a shift from the folkloric to the clinical and the sensational. The concept of the cannibal killer emerged with figures like Albert Fish in the United States and Japan's Issei Sagawa, captivating and horrifying the public with their documented acts of anthropophagy. Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee cannibal, became a household name, his crimes of murder, necrophilia, and cannibalism reported in gruesome detail by a global media machine. These modern cases are tried in courts of law, not of theology, and are explained through the lens of psychiatry and sexual deviance rather than demonic possession. Yet the public reaction remains one of primal horror and macabre fascination, proving that the cultural shockwave produced by such acts is as powerful today as it was in 1722. Perhaps the most telling evolution of the archetype is in the realm of fiction. The most famous modern cannibal, Dr. Hannibal Lecter, is a direct intellectual descendant of these historical and folkloric figures. Like Hans Trapp, Lecter is a man of wealth, taste, and immense sophistication who hides a monstrous appetite. He is the ultimate refinement of the cannibal monster, no longer a desperate peasant or a backwoods brute, but a symbol of how evil can exist at the very highest levels of culture and intellect. His character and the immense popularity of the stories featuring him demonstrate that our fascination with the cannibal is not diminishing. It is simply becoming more complex. We are no longer just afraid of being eaten. We are terrified of the charming, intelligent predator who can justify his atrocities and who sees the rest of humanity not as equals, but as livestock. The story that began with a charcoal burner in Westphalia is therefore a story without an end. The figure of the cannibal is a cultural constant because it represents the absolute negation of human bonds. In a world that can often feel fragmented and alienating, the idea of a person who would literally consume another represents the final, most complete form of betrayal and isolation. It is the fear that community is an illusion, that in the end we are all just meat, and that the hunger of another can at any moment turn us from a person into a meal. The legend of the Münster cannibal is a stark historical reminder that this fear is not unfounded. It is a dark thread in the tapestry of human history, a story that continues to be told because on some deep and unsettling level, we know that it is a story that is always waiting to be written again. The journey into the heart of this darkness is now complete. We have followed the trail from the historical crime to a folkloric legend and finally to its modern incarnations. The cannibal is a monster that reflects our deepest fears about society, survival, and our own humanity. But the world is full of such shadows, each with a story waiting to be told. If you are drawn to the unsolved, to the places where history whispers and legends walk, then your quest for knowledge is far from over. We are dedicated to uncovering these tales, to bringing light to the darkest corners of our past. To join us on this endless journey of discovery, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell.
Our next exploration into the unknown awaits.